Uh, Good evening. I welcome you all at today's lecture, and I'm very happy that Dr. Karthik is going to make today's lecture on Periyar, and I'm very privileged to introduce him. Dr. Karthik has recently joined as Assistant Professor of Social Science at National Law School of Indian University, Bangalore. And he studied at Loyola College and the Asian College of Journalism at Chennai before pursuing a master degree in history from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he earned his PhD in government from University of Essex, where he was also a graduate teacher assistant. And before joining the law school in Bengaluru, he worked as senior lecturer at the School of Development, Azim Premji University, and as assistant professor of political science at SSS Kolkata, and Marie Curie Research Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton. He was awarded a European Union Marie Curie Action Individual Fellowship for his 2-year research project titled Freedom from Caste, the Political Thought of Periyar E.V. Ramasamy in a Global Context. And it's very prestigious. I believe that one of those rare occasions when this prestigious and highly competitive fellowship was awarded for research on critical Indian thinker. He has many number of publication his credit. His article has appeared in many reputed international journals. His first monograph was on Fanon, Identity and Resistance, in which he reflect on the question of identity. It was published in 2009 by Orient BlackSwan. And his recent book is on Periyar, titled as Periyar, a Study in Political Atheism, which again published by Orient BlackSwan, which deal with the concept of political atheism. And today he's going to speak from his book. So Karthik, I welcome you. And now you can speak for 45 minutes around, and then we can have 20-minute question answer. And I request people, if they have some question, please hold them and they can ask at the end of the lecture. They will be allowed to directly ask question from the speaker. Karthik, stage you, please.
Dear Nishikant, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at CSDS. And I consider it my honor to be speaking today at this remarkable research institution, and to be in conversation with such a prolific scholar of Gandhi, such as yourself. And I also very eagerly look forward to your critical comments and the interaction that will follow my presentation. So before I start my presentation, I just want to give an idea of where this book is coming from, and how it was actually written, the how and why of this book. Generally, I mean, if you visit Tamil Nadu as a visitor or something, you are bound to come across statues of this bearded man who looks like a Hindu saint, or perhaps like Socrates or some thinker with a cane in his hand. And so if you ask people, they would let you know that this is Periyar E.V. Ramasamy, the leader of the Dravidian movement, the founder of the self-respect movement. And many are likely to point out that he was a Natigan, derived from Nastiga, and which, in the archaic usage, Nastiga refers to someone who defies the authority of the Vedas, or does not believe in the authority of the Vedas. But then in a popular usage, especially in South India, Nastiga or Natiga, as it is said in Tamil, has come to refer to atheism as such. not just denying of the Vedas, because there are many religious cults in India or religious movements in India which did not take the Vedas as sacrosanct. But in modern or more contemporary usage, Natigam or Nastigam in Tamil vocabulary came to refer to people who did not believe in any sort of religion as such. And one of the most prominent Natigavadis or atheists of the previous century was Periyar E.V. Ramasamy. On the pedestal of many of his statues in Tamil Nadu, you are bound to come across this very provocative slogan of his: "There is no God, there is no God, there is no God. He who worships God is a barbarian. He who propagates God is a scoundrel. He who believes in God is a thief," or something of that sort. These lines which I mentioned in my book. So basically, it appears that Periyar has some sort of a personal crusade against God and religion, or more specifically Hinduism. And these are some of the accusations which he has faced in his own lifetime. So he has been accused of being anti-God. He has been accused of being anti-Brahmin. He has been accused of being anti-Hindu, of being anti-religion, of offending religious sentiments. And therefore, by virtue of all of these, he has also been accused of being anti-Indian. And we know how potent this charge can be in certain atmospheres at this moment, and even at several other moments in the past. But having said that, what I found is that not just among the general layman critique of Periyar, but even among well-established academics who encountered Periyar or who had criticisms of him, they tended to attribute to him a sort of a crude atheism, which emphasized rejection of religion purely on a very limited empirical verificationist basis. So Periyar as such has been accused even by well-meaning academics and scholars of paying too much attention to the ritual dimension of Hinduism, to paying too much attention to the characters and figures of the epics and of the Puranas, and not paying enough attention to actual social problems. So in other words, they tended to portray Periyar as a sort of an atheist who did not really address the crucial social and political concerns of his time, most notably, but not restricted to, the question of caste, and especially the manner in which caste affected the people who are located at the bottommost of the social hierarchy, namely the Dalits or the untouchable community. So these are sort of several, a summary of several criticisms which were placed on Periyar, which I encountered in my research on Periyar. But having read the primary works of Periyar, unfortunately, the majority of the primary works of Periyar are in Tamil. They run to anywhere between 37 to 40 volumes. I mean, when I was doing my research, I had 37 volumes at hand, but I believe there are more and some others on the way. And likewise, we still do not have a proper documentation of the private correspondence of Periyar with his contemporaries. So as intellectual historians, there is an expansive resource with which we can trace a primary material of Periyar, but even that material is comprehensive, but not complete as such. It's not the final definitive edition which we can call the collected works of Periyar. So Periyar's works have been collected and collected and published as the volumes of Periyar Kalanjiyam by the Dravidar Kazhagam. And reading these volumes, right, I was able to discover a thinker whose atheism was not just a criticism of religion, but fundamentally a criticism of social power and more specifically state power, right? So this is the topic which I plan to address in the course of this presentation. And my main contention over here is that political atheism is a challenge to political theology. So political atheism acknowledges the unity or affinity of religion and the state, and it opposes or criticizes both. It realizes that statism relies on similar mystifications like theology and seeks to demystify the supposedly mysterious, wondrous, and miraculous. It is a negative program that defies the yes of the divine and the secular sovereign. Instead, it asserts the sovereignty of the individual and their inalienable freedom. Now, as you would be familiar, the greatest theorist of political theology in the past century was the German thinker Carl Schmitt. In his work, Political Theology, Schmitt identifies the sovereign as, and I quote him, he who decides on the exception. This is probably the simplest and the most powerful definition of the sovereign which we have come across till now. And to Schmitt, sovereignty resides in determining definitively what constitutes public order and security, and in determining when they are disturbed. So the sovereign decides whether a situation is normal or an exception. And anyone interested in politics must be interested in the relation between these. The parallel in theology is in the concept of good and evil, where evil is the exception to the good. And what is evil is interpreted with reference to the good of God. Or the figure of God decides the exception of evil. So if the exception in a Schmittian sense is an attempt to restore order in a political sense, then the concept of evil is an attempt to restore order in a theological sense. So Schmitt argues that the crucial concepts in the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, both because of their historical development and because of their systematic structure. The exception and evil thus are concepts integral to ideas of political order and good. In making a powerful case for political theology, Carl Schmitt was also responding to two currents in Europe that were challenging both political and theological order, namely Marxism and anarchism. In my reading, I view Periyar as a thinker who's a lot closer to anarchism than to Marxism. There have been readings that have tried to develop a Periyarist Marxism in Tamil Nadu, or to have a Marxist reading of Periyar in Tamil Nadu. But what I've tried over here, which I think is something new, is to read Periyar in the anarchist tradition and to understand how he develops his concept of political atheism. Because in my reading, Periyar was not a liberal atheist who restricted his criticisms to religion alone. His was a political atheism that expressed disbelief in both God and state, that attacked both religious and political forms of oppression, highlighting their interlinks. So while there is evidence from history, such as Periyar's Soviet Union travel, I've discussed this in some detail in the first chapter of my book. You know, how enthusiastic he was during and after his travel to the Soviet Union, his interaction with the top Soviet leaders, and how he wanted to propagate a form of socialism in India. So there is evidence from all of this that he attempted to engage with Marxist politics. But then there is little or nothing to suggest that he intellectually engaged with anarchist thinkers or with anarchism in general. And likewise, anarchism was not of any major political significance in South India in his time. Likewise, another point of difference between Periyar and the anarchists is that where the anarchists were opposed to the use of the state for even a transitional situation, Periyar had a very cautious approach to the state, and he did not give a call for its immediate abolition. Periyar's utopia of the future, he writes it in this tract called Inivarum Ulagam, written in 1944, which translates to this world to come. He outlines his utopia as a stateless society which does not have capitalism or caste or religion or gender-based oppression and so on. In the contemporary, when he was operating, he fought for greater rights for the subaltern castes, especially with regards to proportional representation within the ambits of the existing Indian state. So over here, one might perhaps find similarities to the strategies of state socialism than anarchism. But the purpose of the book is to show that there is much in the essence of Periyar's political thought to suggest a greater affinity with anarchist thinking, especially with regard to religion and social power. In essence, I'm arguing, Periyar's works reveal his greater interest in the unmasking of power rather than in replacing it with anything akin to a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat. My argument as such is that Periyar's critique of political theology was a lot closer to anarchism than to Marxism. Now, Mikhail Bakunin, the famed Russian anarchist thinker, believed that the state and religion were bonded in an unholy marriage that prevented the emancipation of the poor and the working classes, keeping them in a state of subservience. Periyar, while not explicitly anti-statist like Bakunin, nevertheless saw the Indian state as a hurdle for the emancipation of the Dalits and the intermediate castes. Periyar argued that the Indian state and the Brahmins worked together to keep the lower caste in a state of permanent subservience. But he does this without supporting an alternate nationalism or a nation-state formation. Periyar's grudge against state power, if one might say that, was that the Indian nation-state privileged the Brahmins and condemned the intermediate caste and the Dalits to being in the state of Shudrahood and untouchability. He claimed that not just by religion, but even by secular law, non-Brahmins who were in the Hindu fold, including rationalists and atheists, were treated as Shudras. He accused religion and law in general for gender-biased moral prescriptions, which privileged men and curtailed the liberties of women. The seeds of modern Tamil atheism, laid by secular thinkers of the 19th century, like Attipakam Venkatachala Nayaka, found their full germination in the thoughts and works of Periyar E.V. Ramasamy. However, it was not just a rejection of religion. Periyar's anti-Brahmanism, I argue, was a political atheism that sought to critique, demystify, and dismantle the political theology of Brahmanism. Periyar believed that an elite class in India stood in the way of the law of equality. This elite class, the Brahmins mainly, used the Hindu religion to ensure their superiority in society and the state. He argued that the state was an instrument to cement the superiority of the upper caste. M.S.S. Pandian, for instance, details how Periyar used the dominant narrative of Hinduism as shaped by Orientalist scholarship and native Brahmin intellectuals to conflate Hinduism with Aryanism and Brahmanism. Periyar saw religion as an institution of social power that privileged the Brahmins as an elite caste group to the detriment of equality and liberty of women and castes lower in the Hindu hierarchy. Periyar located the oppression of these groups not merely in class terms like Mikhail Bakunin, but also with respect to their marginalized identities. He believed that Hinduism was incapable of self-reform and only its removal could once and for all eradicate casteism. So, as I referred to this pamphlet called Inivaru Mulagam, this world to come, he believed that science and rationality would displace God and that the West, he was referring to the Soviet Union, was setting an example of such a society. Along with God, states, war, money, slavery, and oppression of women would also end, and there would be a universal community where the oppression of any would provoke the indignation of all. To Periyar, God was a relic from the barbaric times, which had been adapted by the Brahmins to perpetuate their dominance. But Periyar also says, and I quote him, "People say that there is an omnipotent and omnipresent God, but I'm not calling for his abolition. I'm only calling for the abolition of that God who approves and strengthens the caste order." One of the key obstacles in the journey towards Periyar's utopia were the Hindu religionists who were mired in superstition and an admiration for mythical pasts. He saw the campaign for rationalism as a vital challenge to the Hindu religionists and to empower the lower castes. In his words, and I quote him, "What I'm doing is not political work, but a work for rationalism. Rationalism must spread among the people. Rationalism must be taught to those people who have been brutally oppressed, and they must be humanized." Rationalism to Periyar was the life of humanity, and this life was denied to the lower caste by the Brahmins, God, religion, and the scriptures. Periyar says, and I quote him, "The rationalist must have no belief in God, no belief in religion. They should have no attachment to God, religion, country, or language. They should not care for ancestor worship." To Periyar, such attachments were learned and thus could be unlearned, and he urged that only the only attachment for rationalists should be the progress of humanity. So Periyar was critical of both Brahmins and non-Brahmins who upheld the Hindu religion. He argued that the imitation of Brahmin practices has resulted in the degrading and the enslaving of womankind, and he called for the end of such traditions. He routinely condemned the epics and the Puranas for the degradation of women. Locating the evil of misogyny and casteism in the Hindu gods, he called for their abolition. Echoing Mikhail Bakunin's rejoinder to Voltaire. So Voltaire had famously said, if God does not exist, it is necessary to invent him. So Bakunin's rejoinder was that if God exists, it is necessary to abolish him. So echoing a sort of a similar sentiment, Periyar says, it is said that God created untouchability. If that is true, the first thing to do would be to abolish such a God. If God is unaware of this cruel practice, then he should be abolished sooner. If he is unable to prevent this injustice or stop the unjust, then he has no business to exist anywhere in the world. End quote. Periyar argued that Nastigam, which I refer to, the Tamil equivalent of atheism, got a bad name because of the force of religious traditions that successfully criminalized atheism and free thinking. In the early 1930s, he greatly appreciated the mushrooming of atheist associations in the West and wanted similar groups to emerge in South India. To Periyar, atheism and attacks on established religions were an indication of social progress in history. Interestingly, he saw religious figures like Jesus Christ, the Buddha, and Muhammad as progressives of their times, whereas atheists like Darwin, Marx, and Lenin were progressive of theirs. For instance, he says that Christ and Muhammad, who said that there were not 1,000 gods but only one, were rationalists of their times. But in contemporary times, saying that there was no God was the only true rationalism, according to Periyar. Echoing Lenin, he was convinced that atheism was necessary for the propagation of socialist thought. However, he was also of the opinion that atheism and rationalism alone would not make an egalitarian society. At one place, he says that for India to prosper, not only does it need atheism, but also unconditional support for women's liberation. Likewise, reminiscing on his travel to Paris, he noted the differences between the atheist groups of the working class and that of the bourgeoisie. So Periyar's concern was not that atheism be adopted as a philosophy, but that it be turned to productive social uses. He asserts, Periyar asserts that people must realize their own strength and gain self-mastery to reject the oppressive structures of religion, caste, and gender oppression and live as liberated individuals. So Periyar understands rationalism as a faculty to reason why things are bad and to explore how they can be better. While he does hold rationalism as an enemy of theology, he also posits it as a critique of secular problems. To Periyar, those countries where there are inequalities, where people are discontented because of inequalities, where there is the problem of selfish private competition, in such places there will not be full rationalism. Rationalism and atheism to Periyar are not end goals, they are means for a critical interrogation of existing power structures. Periyar saw rationalism to be intertwined with revolution. This made Periyar's atheism a political atheism that did not restrict itself to a mere rejection of or disbelief in God, but a critical opposition to social, political, moral, and philosophical systems that mystified the oppressive conditions in which humanity existed. The task of political atheism was to demystify these along with religions. Now, I also want to highlight over here what was Periyar's difference with the communists, with whom he was sometime a co-traveler and many times a critic as well, and why I would prefer to read him in the anarchist tradition, right? So after his tour in the Soviet Union, Periyar began aggressively promoting socialist ideas, arranging for the translation of Marxist texts to Tamil, denouncing nationalism and hailing the virtues of proletarian internationalism. After consultations with local communists, the self-respecters passed a set of resolutions demanding radical land reforms, minimal wages, improving of living conditions for workers, public ownerships of essential services, state control of religious bodies, and prohibition of caste. Apprehensive of the radicalization of the self-respect movement, the colonial government began a crackdown on its leaders and cadres, and many, including Periyar, had to serve terms in prison. Fearing that the progress made by the self-respect movement would achieve severe setbacks under continued repression, Periyar made a break with his erstwhile communist allies, even though he would be attracted to socialist ideals for the rest of his life. But there was another crucial reason for his distancing from the Indian communists. Selig Harrison observes that the communists won at several places in Tamil Nadu in the 1951 elections, owing largely to support from Periyar's DK. But they were not on the same ground on many issues, most notably the caste question and the national question. Periyar, Selig Harrison says, was strongly critical of Brahmin preponderance in Tamil communist leadership and believed that a consequence of this was, and I quote Harrison, Tamil communist subservience to North Indian domination, not to mention the bypassing of the problem of caste. To Periyar, the most complete expression of political Brahmanism was nationalism, and he felt that the Indian communists uncritically celebrated nationalism and took no account of its religious and caste basis. In an article written in 1944 titled Communism or Common Rights, What Should Come First, Periyar prioritizes common rights. Noting that the Indian Communist Party was dominated by caste elites, he argued that as long as a caste exists, any form of communism would only benefit the Brahmins, since a mere change in economic status would not necessarily bring a change in ritual hierarchy. He mockingly referred to the Indian communists as communist devotees, much like how Bakunin dubbed the European communists as fervent believers. And Periyar criticized them for failing to take a clear stand on caste and ritual hierarchies. Contrasting with the Soviet Union, Periyar said, since the Western countries did not have caste, they had to wage a class war before communism could be reached. Here, owing to the presence of caste, it is necessary to wage a caste war before achieving communism. Periyar differentiates between caste and class in that class is determined by relation to labor, whereas caste is a marker determined by birth in relation to a religiously sanctioned hierarchy. He asserts, and I quote him, in a country where there are no common rights, communism would only strengthen those who have been enjoying greater rights, adding that the abolishing of the privilege of the upper caste would result in going halfway towards the communist ideal. Not only did subaltern castes need to reject Hinduism, but even for the struggles of the poor and the working class for equality and communism, Brahmanism had to be challenged first. At a speech in 1953, Periyar candidly says, and I quote him in detail, I'm not against communism or socialism. I have more commitment and interest in communism and socialism than others. But we must have a communism and socialism that is adapted to this country's needs. Unless and until the superiority of the Brahmins and Brahmanism, which are most powerful and are fundamentally opposed to socialism or communism, are abolished in this country, communism or socialism cannot form here. Instead, only Brahmanism will get strengthened. End quote. In March 1973, 6 months before his death, Periyar asserted that social equality was as important as, perhaps even a prerequisite for economic equality, and that those who believe in socialism should work for a social revolution and the annihilation of caste. He sensed that the Indian communists not only failed to challenge Brahmanism, but often ended up as apologists for the same. Periyar suspected that the universality that was guaranteed by communism in the Indian scenario would be appropriated by the upper caste to secure their own particular interests. In this, he was not rejecting the universality of communism. He was rather criticizing the upper caste for being unable to transcend their particularity. But equally, he was apprehensive that the Marxist dogma functioned as yet another mantra for the Indian elite caste to capture and retain power while maintaining the ritual hierarchy. So my interpretation in this book as such is that despite his fascination for the Soviet Union, which was a sort of a lifelong fascination, Periyar was quite apprehensive about the prospects of a genuine communism in India without going through a period of radical social reform. Now, where Bakunin suspected that the Marxist variant of socialism would inevitably lead to the dictatorship of a theoretically sophisticated elite over the masses, Periyar accused the Indian Marxist movement of being dominated by the priestly class. And to Periyar, without this social reform, communism in India would be a dictatorship of a priestly class. Another crucial difference from the communists was Periyar's approach to organizational politics. Periyar asserts that Dravida Kazhagam is not a political party. It is a party to do with society. I have always maintained that politics is an aspect of society, end quote. Periyar expresses his criticism of the idea that society can be changed by capturing political power. On the contrary, he considers political power as a hindrance to social reform. He instead believes that functioning as a pressure group, working with people for social causes, can enable his movement to compel those in power to implement favorable policies. The anarchist thinker John Holloway favors the idea of power to over power over. The former, power to, represents a social capacity for collective action, while the latter, power over, represents the exercise of coercion over society. Periyar clearly favors the idea of power to, where he argues that his intention is not capturing state power, but mobilizing society to ensure that the state was kept in check and that the people got their due. While Periyar desires that the state will be abolished in the future, unlike the Bakuninists, he does not act immediately to abolish the same. His organizational strategy was to hold politics accountable to society by his emphasis on increasing collective social consciousness. More specifically, the subaltern community's power to change things rather than a vanguard capturing power over society. Periyar says, and I quote him, "We do not want political power, only the power to think." So Periyar's political atheism, to sum it up, was a critique of all forms of established power. While he believed in the importance of samatvam, which translates to equality, and samadharmam, which is a neologism of Periyar, the Tamil equivalent of socialism, it was coupled with the stress that he placed on vidudalai, freedom. So samatvam and samadharmam were incomplete without vidudalai. That is, equality and socialism were incomplete without freedom. This was freedom from social, economic, religious, political forms of oppression and hierarchy, and also freedom towards achieving self-mastery and individuality. Periyar saw the dominant religion in India and the Indian state and its apparatus like law, education, police, press, and the others to be tainted by Brahmanism. Though at different points of time in his life, he viewed communism or conversions to other religions to be options to fight Brahmanism, he did not believe in substituting one form of power for the another. He saw approaches that concentrated power in the hands of a few, whether they be priests or an elitist vanguard, to be harmful for the many. His critique of the political theology of Brahmanism was a multi-pronged attack on what he thought to be the multiple manifestations of Brahmanism in both religious and secular spheres. He identified Hinduism to be the main religious, theological form of Brahmanism, and the state and its institutions to be the secular form. During certain political utterances, some of Periyar's approaches might seem inconsistent. For instance, his statement that communism shared the common goals of major religions, or his support for the Congress-ruled state during the rule of Kamaraja. But underlying these, the essence of Periyar's text strongly suggests that his persistent critique of secularized theological concepts, his opposition to both God and the state, indicate a sort of a positioning of Periyar within a sort of an anarchist tradition. So, can I wind up now? Is it good?
Have you finished, or you want?
Yeah. I've addressed most of the main points which I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you. It was great listening to you, and I like the way you have presented that how Periyar was projected in some of prominent scholar, that he concentrate on less important issues than the social and political issues which were necessary to address at that time, and then how he shared some similarities with Marxist and socialism. And but I really think it's a new perspective you brought, that he was not only against the God religious theological, but the state secular theologies. But I think I need to read your book, because I think 1 hour is not enough, and it seems that's not very convincing. I will say the argument there should be more, because there are, you himself cited, there are the example which suggests that he wanted to work, he supported Kamraj government and wanted to work with state. And the another problem is your formulation. I find that if there is no state, there is no religion, then what is the way he wanted to organize the society, human body? Is it anarchist of kind of Gandhian kind, that every enlightened rational people will able to organize their life and society without any power? Is it a utopian for which he was looking for, or there was some stages through which this stage we can reach? He suggested, I thought
Nishikant, I missed the last sentence of yours.
I was telling, can the society, by abolishing the state and religion, can automatically transform in such a stage? Or he proposed there are some intermediate stages through which the society will go through, and he has some plan and all that, if such the case. And I also find one thing very amazing, that you said he said he did not want to capture the state, and he wanted to remain as a pressure group, and to so there are just for curiosity, I was wondering how the formulation will work. Means, in place of pressurizing, if you have the state in your hand, you can do the same thing. So what is the need for pressurizing state and doing? But later you said that because it is he was against the state, that's why there was the philosophical difference for taking the state in hand, or but if you wanted to do the work done by the state, then it is better to take state in hand. So I hope I made my point clear. If you can clarify these things, or I can take some few more question, and then you can respond to them.
Can I first respond to you?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So Nishikant, regarding if he has got a plan or a blueprint, right? So there's something which I start off in begin with in the first chapter of my book, is that Periyar is not a theorist, right? So there are some of his Periyar supporters who want to project him as a theorist or as a coherent philosopher, but I don't think he was ever that, right? Because he was more of a man of direct action. And most of his writings and speeches are connected to a certain particular problem he was facing at an immediate point of time. So there's actually very few occasions in his entire corpus of writings where he is trying to reflect upon any particular problem in a a rigorous theoretical sense and provide a sort of a meta framework, if one were to say. So in fact, I would say the only sort of coherent book which Periyar wrote in his time was this pamphlet called Penyen Adimayanal, or Why Women Were Enslaved, right? So that's the only sort of pamphlet which Periyar wrote in his time, which tries to analyze the oppression of women and suggest possible ways of liberation. But other than that, regarding state power, regarding caste, regarding uh, religion or nationalism, say that this is a Periyarist theory. But having said that, it is also my argument that his writings and speeches nevertheless form sizable and voluminous stuff to theorize what his position on state, on nationalism, on religion, and so on and so forth can be, by trying to arrive at a sort of an essence or a core of his writings. Now, regarding the state and his plan for the state as such, there is this sort of a short pamphlet which I referred to, which he wrote in 1944, which is called This World to Come. In Tamil, it is called Inivarum Ulagam. So over there, he is just more or less subscribing to the idea of a global working class revolution, right? More or less. But he believes that in the Indian specific case, it will happen as a revolution of the oppressed non-Brahmin communities, who would come together and overthrow and have a sort of a socialist form of government. But he does not specify what is this form of government. So he does not say, make any claims on whether this will be a dictatorship, whether this will be a dictatorship of the oppressed class or anything of that sort. So he just says very sort of loosely that looking at the way in which revolutions are happening in other parts of the world, such revolutions could happen and should happen in a country like India, which requires the transgressing of caste boundaries, and which will also lead to the annihilation of caste boundaries. But this document is not a blueprint. It is still a sort of a utopian vision of what Periyar believes the world will be like, or what the world should be like tomorrow. He does not really give a sort of a very specific, clear program on what to do and how this will lead to a higher state of society, which actually relates to your next major point. Why not just capture state power instead of putting pressure on it? Is that Periyar believed that capturing state power would necessarily lead to a compromise with the dominant ideological power, namely that of Brahmanism. So, for instance, he tells, he says at different points of time in his career, whether he is supporting Kamarajar, or whether he's supporting Annadurai, or whether he's supporting Karnanidhi, all of these were chief ministers of Tamil Nadu. Even while supporting them, he tells that all of these political leaders are limited by the positions which they hold, right? They cannot criticize religion or social practices with the sort of freedom which Periyar has, right? So Periyar says that he needs, or a social reform movement needs, this sort of a freedom to be constantly critical of any and all forms of social power, while a position within the within the state would necessarily entail a sort of a compromise with the prevailing social and religious power. So Periyar believed that instead, acting from outside the ambits of the state and trying to pressure the state or create and increase social consciousness was a better way of bringing about the rationalist society that he saw as a desirable end goal.
Okay, thank you. So if there is question, okay, 1, 2.
Thank you, Karthik, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Avdhendra Sharan. I'm trying to understand intellectually what is at stake for you in terms of this division between socialism and anarchism. Because on the one hand, obviously from what you've said, there is a great fascination for socialism globally, but a deep dissatisfaction with actually existing communism in India for its Brahmanical roots. And similarly, as you're responding to the question of state, there is a dissatisfaction with a state that is necessarily compromised with Brahmanism, but a belief that you can, through radical pressure, you can bring about changes, some of which may be through the state, some of which may be within the society. So I'm still trying to grasp, given this complexity and given that you're saying that he's not a systematic thinker, what is at stake for you as an intellectual to put such a sharp theoretical reading on Periyar? Is he a socialist? Is he an anarchist? It's almost like you're asking for a political philosophical question, having said that he's not a theorist.
See, my stake as such, I mean, I would say one of the key aims of my research project has, apart from providing my own take on Periyar, has been to challenge the mistakes on Periyar, right? So which I believed offered certain sort of mistaken readings of Periyar, which I don't think finds any sort of validation in his own intellectual genealogy, nor in his the corpus of his works, right? I personally, in my reading of Periyar, what I have found is that, while he does not really aim to be a sort of a coherent theoretician, there are certain aspects of his thought which are consistent from the time he started his political career till his demise in 1973. And one of which I would strongly say is his strong criticisms of any and all forms of established power, right? Which also, I believe, places him much closer within the anarchist tradition than within the more statist forms of socialism. My contemporary interest in doing this as such is the recent trends, mainly in parts of Latin America, and one could say even in Europe, where the old forms of the Leninist forms of socialism are being challenged and are being replaced or maybe even overthrown by more decentralized forms of socialism. I've also been very interested in the Kurdish movement in the Middle East, and learning from all of these movements and what they have to offer as alternatives to the socialism of the 20th century. I also somewhere feel that a rereading of Periyar, which is happening in South India at the moment, I would say that it's actually, there's a lot more interest in Periyar now ever since 2014 than it has ever been at any other point of time in the past. I also think that the sort of new readings of Periyar which are happening now, it would be really sort of good to have this sort of a global sort of a comparative perspective and to look at these more decentralist, non-statist forms of socialisms and see how Periyarism as a thought and as a possible political practice can fit in. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question.
Ravi Ganji.
Yeah, I'm Ravikant. I quite enjoyed the talk. Two, three related questions. I understand, this resentment or critique, resentment towards a critique of power, right, is also part of the same story. And so it's also about the party, right? He doesn't like the party, Periyar Saab. So it's quite clear, and that is why now from your answer to Deepu's question, right, it's clear that there is something else that is going on. So in that sense, I want to ask you whether, his relationship with other people, other socialists or communists of the time, even if they were, upper caste, Brahmanical, etc., and, his confrontations, for example, his questioning, all of that, you should, do we have any literature on that, any correspondence, etc.? So you want to say something on that? Secondly, I want to, also understand his position on language vis-a-vis what is happening, North versus South, So where does, and the newly invented kind of Tamil, right? Which is anti-Brahmanical or non-Brahmanical, at least, if not anti-Brahmanical. So vis-a-vis North, but also vis-a-vis, Tamil itself, tradition of literary, literature. Yeah, thanks.
Karthik, you take one more question from Prabhaji.
Yeah, but can I answer one by one? I tend to lose track otherwise. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. So regarding Periyar's relation to the community, as I told in the start of my presentation, there's still a lot of the sort of private correspondence which Periyar had with many leaders, which has not yet seen the light of the day, right? It would be a great boon to the intellectual history of South India or the Dravidian movement, whatever, if we could have access to the correspondences which he had with his confidant for a long time, Mr. S. Ramanathan, who was a communist and a Trotskyite sympathizer, who was Periyar's co-traveler and who also accompanied with him on his Soviet trips and so on. Likewise, Periyar's correspondence with the other sort of communist leaders of his time, Jivanandam, Singaravelar, and so on, might reveal a different sort of aspect of Periyar's relationship to these leaders and the movements which they led. But then again, if we are to go by the sort of political positions and the explicit political statements, speeches, articles which he has written, it does appear that Periyar always wanted to sort of cultivate a camaraderie between his movement and the communist movement, but at several points of time in history was let down by them, or he at least felt let down by them. So I'll just give one example, right? This incident often, unfortunately, is not even remembered that much by the communists in South India, is the massacre of the communists in, I forget the jail, I think it could be the Salem jail, in 1951, soon after India's independence under Rajaji's chief ministership. Now, one of the very few rare voices who raised his protest against this massacre was Periyar, right? So he strongly condemned this atrocity. He called it a sort of a fascist sort of an atrocity, and criticize the government for its extreme high-handedness in dealing with the leftists and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, very soon after, even though the communists were basking in the support of Periyar and the self-respect movement, they were also simultaneously branding Periyar and the self-respecters as anti-nationals and separatists. Right. So this was a sort of a big letdown for Periyar, So while he was condemning the Tamil Nadu government for its excessive force against the communists, you had the communists raising slogans like, Kekade, Kekade, Dravidan Nadu Kekade. Basically means that don't demand, don't ever demand for Dravidan Nadu. Right. So this sort of what shall I say, non-reciprocal affection which Periyar had for the communists eventually led to much more stronger frictions and sort of a complete fallout. And likewise, it has due to several factors, the communists were often found themselves on the opposite side where Periyar was on. Right. For instance, in the sort of the political climate created after the Mudukalatur riots of the 1950s, when the Kamaraj government arrested the person who was considered to be one of the key figures of the riots, Mr. Muthuramalinga Devar, the communists were supporting Muthuramalinga Devar while Periyar was while Periyar was supporting the Kamaraj government in the arrest of Muthuramalinga Devar, because he believed that this gentleman was responsible for caste riots in South Tamil Nadu. So these are just some of the key sort of incidents where the communists and Periyarists found themselves on polar opposite positions, and which is why Periyar, always took care to maintain that he always has sympathy for some form of socialism, but he has no faith as such in the Indian communists as such to solve the social problems of India. On the language issue, I mean, Bernard Bate has this remarkable work called, on the Tamil oratory and the Dravidian aesthetic, where he gives Periyar considerable credit for plebeianizing the Tamil political language, right? Because until Periyar, Tamil was generally spoken in a very archaic and in a very ornate way. Whereas Periyar made it as a sort of a more easily communicable sort of a language, which was coarse, sometimes vulgar, but always in a very sort of a casual and spoken Tamil. Mainly because Periyar did not have any big fascination for celebrating one's own language over the other, right? So he tells at several points of time, the only reason why he opposes Hindi is because this will practically and materially affect the non-Hindi speaking population, and not because Tamil is supposed to be a great or an old language. In fact, at one place he even says, if you are claiming that it's, he's mocking the Tamil nationalists. He says that if you claim that your language is old, you should probably put it in the dustbin, because that's what we do to old and outdated things, right? This is the reason why, along with the Hindu right, the Tamil nationalists also have a huge grudge against Periyar. So his language politics as such was that each region must develop its own very accessible and democratic language, but not a sort of take any sort of linguistic pride or chauvinism. So that was his overall position on language.
Prabhatji, please.
I have a very pointed thing to ask. It's more in the spirit of clarification, if you could give. I mean, after listening to your lecture and then your extensive and quite satisfying answers, what crossed in my mind is that Periyar is, I mean, what is the self-image of Periyar as such? I mean, the self-image in a sense that whether he sees himself as a politician, whether he sees himself as an ascetic renunciator standing outside, but who knows inside out, who's familiar with everything and has an advantage, moral advantage, political advantage, and all sorts of things. So, because there are people who, there are works which deal, I mean, Gandhi, the ascetic, the philosopher, outsider, and so on and so forth. And then this, you can interpret whether it's a new kind of anarchism. I mean, because, I mean, that's, I'm not unhappy with the way you approach, because at the heart of it, you have this self-conscious decision that you don't impose the preformed category and do the deficit analysis that whether he is adequately anarchist or socialist and so forth. What he is that you are trying to trace. So where does that figure of renunciator, or if at all that works? Because in most of the cases, and it's not certainly Brahmanical, renunciator is anti-Brahmanical, a non-Brahmanical, all kinds of traditions we have in the local genealogy in South Asia as such.
Thank you. Yeah. So how does Periyar see himself? I mean, I will rather use his own words before going into mine. So he says, and I quote him, "I am a reformer of the human society. I do not care about country, God, religion, language, or the state. I am only concerned about the welfare and growth of the human society." End quote. So he views himself as such, as a social reformer and an activist primarily. Right? So in a sense, he's, you could say that he is also acting as a renunciator, because he has renounced what he criticizes as the craving of people who enter public life, namely political power, right? And there is a corresponding term in Tamil for this, namely Turavi, which means the person who has given up, right? So there are some people who look at Periyar as a sort of a secular Turavi, or a secular renunciator of power and of position as such. In fact, as you rightly said, there are other sorts of non-Brahmanical, perhaps even anti-Brahmanical traditions of renunciation. One of the very common example which comes to mind from the South Indian case is that of the Siddhars, who were sort of wandering ascetics who preached spirituality, but also mocked the authority of rituals, of castes, of idol worship, of Vedic practices, and so on and so forth. And one could possibly definitely read Periyar in this sort of a socio-historical cultural tradition, and I do hint upon that as well in my the first chapter of my book. So yes, definitely, I would see or like to look at an engagement with Periyar as a sort of a political renunciator. Yes.
Thank you. If there is a question from screen, anyone want to ask, may raise his or her hand. We may allow them to ask, or otherwise we will wind up. Okay, so it seems there is no question. Okay, thank you, Karthik. It was really very fresh to listen your very fresh new thoughts and new way of interpreting Periyar. I would like to thank our director for his guidance, Sachin, Ayodhya, and Praveen ji for the support, and Ravikant ji and Prabhat ji and Rakesh ji for attending, and other who attended online and Facebook. So I thanks everyone for attending the seminar, and once again thanks Karthik for accepting our invitation and for giving. Thank you. So we may now part. Thank you, Karthik.
Thank you all so much. I really had a great time, and looking forward to talking soon. Thank you.
Okay, bye.